Okay, in this homework assignment, try it 19-3, we're going to calculate the predetermined overhead allocation rate, and then we are going to allocate overhead, manufacturing overhead, to jobs. So the first step is step 1. This is from our slides. Step 1 is calculating the predetermined overhead rate before the period begins. Okay, so at the beginning of the period, either beginning of the month, or beginning of the quarter, or beginning of the year, depending on the company, they need to calculate total estimated overhead costs. So here's our overhead costs. They need to estimate what the final amount will be. They're going to be wrong, but we need to do it at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the period because we won't know the actual amount till the end of the period. In the meantime, we have to assign these overhead costs to jobs that are finished before the end of the period. So again, we're going to take the total estimated overhead costs and divide it by the total estimated quantity of overhead allocation base. Now, the allocation base is either direct labor hours or direct labor costs or machine hours, depending on if the company is labor intensive or machine intensive. So here's what we've got. Smith Company expected to incur $10,000 in manufacturing overhead costs, and they also expected to use 4,000 machine hours for the year. Actual overhead was $9,700, and the company used 4,250 machine hours. So these last two numbers are the actual numbers that we know. We only know these at the end of the period. But at the beginning of the period, we have to use the estimated data. So step 1, we're going to take the estimated overhead costs and divide by the allocation base, either direct labor costs, direct labor hours, or machine hours. This company chooses to use machine hours. So the predetermined overhead allocation rate, the formula is, we're going to take our estimated overhead that we have to spread across the allocation base, and the allocation base is going to be estimated machine hours. So what we're going to get is a number per machine hour that we're going to use to allocate this manufacturing overhead to jobs. So our estimated overhead costs for the year are $10,000. And our estimated machine hours, the company thought they were going to use 4,000 machine hours. And then when we do the math, we get 10,000 divided by 4,000 equals 2.5. That's also the same as 2.50. You do not have to add the 0, but some people like to because it makes it seem easier to understand now. So what this means is if a job had a machine hour, in other words, if a job had a robot or some other type of machine and it took the machine an hour of time to finish the job, then we're going to allocate $2.50 of this manufacturing overhead. Whatever these actual costs are, we're going to allocate $2.50 of that per machine hour. Next question, how much manufacturing overhead was allocated during the year? So remember, when they allocate it, they take this $2.50 per machine hour and multiply it by the actual hours that they use. So here's our actual hours. So we're going to take our actual machine hours and multiply it by this predetermined overhead allocation rate. So the actual hours that they used the machines was 4,250. Multiply it by 2.5. So we're going to take $4,250 machine hours times 2.5, and that gives us $10,625 of overhead that the company has allocated throughout the year to finish jobs. So later on, so what it turns out is that the company allocated $10,625 of overhead. So the allocation takes place on the right side of the manufacturing overhead account, but their actual costs were $9,700, and the actual costs fall over here. So later in a future video, we'll figure out what to do when the company does not allocate the exact same amount, which they're not going to, because these estimates are not going to be, these two estimates here are not going to be perfect.